The biggest battle we will ever have to face is the battle between you and you. It's the battle of taking your mind to that limit and then breaking through. On the Mindful Experiment podcast, we will share concepts, universal laws, and interviewing individuals who have done just that, who have gone through the dark times and through those moments allowed their light to shine bright. I'm your host, Dr. Vic Manzo, and I want to thank you for listening to the podcast and taking this journey with me as we discover different avenues to break through those limits, expand your reality, and evolve into the person you desire to be. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Dr. Vic, and you are listening to another episode here on the Mindful Experiment. As we had the awesome opportunity of interviewing David Krantz today. He is an epigenetic coach. This may be something new that you may have never heard of the term before, but David has advanced knowledge in many different things about nutrigenomics, nutrigenetics. We talk a little bit about we dive into more of epigenetics. What really is that? How does that influence health, your role, your body, your mind, how stress plays a role, and really how to take yourself and your life to another level each and every single way. He'll explain how gene sequencing, how looking at gene expression and different pathways people have more developed than one versus the other, and how we can influence that through nutrition, through herbs, how we can improve our sleep, how light plays a role in our life, benefits of the good and the bad, how artificial lighting is interfering with our sleep cycles, and so much more. It really is the foundation to giving about understanding peak performance in a certain way by covering it from a gene perspective first and then taking it from there all the way through. I had a lot of time chatting with him on this. There was, being my background as a chiropractor, it was a lot of fun stuff that we can dive into and really share in a simple way about different ways you can create some influence in your health and in your overall life. So with no further ado, I don't want to take any more thunder away from this guy. Welcome, David Krantz, to the show.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Vic. It's a pleasure to be on here. Thanks for having me.
I checked out your biography and everything you do, and I'll tell you, man, I am stoked to have you on and really dive deep. I think we're going to have a lot of rabbit holes to dive through and go through in many different directions. So I'm excited for this next hour.
I'm excited too. It's always a question of which rabbit hole are we going to go down and how deep.
Yeah, I love it. So, just with your vast background and everything, one of the curiosities that I love to ask is just like, how did you get into this? Like, because it's not like, I'm assuming one thing led to another, but please share, if you don't mind, how you got into this whole process with nutrigenics, epigenetics, and all this other stuff that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've always had a interest in science, and I remember when I was taking high school biology, I wrote a lengthy essay about how I thought that biology was at a dead end unless they started incorporating quantum physics into their model. And at the time, I was like, my professor had no idea what I was talking about, but ended up giving me a good grade because he looked up what I was talking about, and was like, I've always just kind of been on the edge of really wanting to explore what are the next level kind of things out there. And, I actually went to school for music. I decided to pursue music more fully, and for a while kind of left my scientific interests in the background. And then I started having a bunch of health issues in my early and mid 20s and didn't get any answers from kind of mainstream Western medicine, as I'm imagine some of your listeners also might have had that experience. And I was passing out randomly. Like, I was having vasovagal responses to things that were really, I probably shouldn't have been. Mm-hmm. And, I saw cardiologists and had a heart monitor implanted in my chest for a short period of time. And it was pretty scary. But they were basically like, yeah, you're actually healthy. There's really nothing we can do, quote unquote, healthy. And I was like, no, this is not what health is supposed to be. There's something wrong here. And so I kind of just embarked on this path of biohacking, and one thing led to another. I ended up doing some work at a medical clinic here in Asheville, North Carolina. And I was producing meditation and mindfulness programs, audio programs for a doctor that ran a clinic. And around at the same time that I got hired to do some, audio and music work for him, he started teaching his method of epigenetics and genetic-based nutrition and very personalized kind of high-level medicine. And I was just there at the right time. And he was like, hey, do you want to take this training program? We're kind of looking for someone to, become a coach and test this out before I make this public. And so I had the fortunate opportunity to have this guy, Dr. Dan Stickler, as my mentor. And if you look him up, he's really one of the kind of top experts in nutrigenomics now. Speaks at all the big conferences. And I've fortunately just had the chance to take what I had learned in terms of my own biohacking path, my longstanding interest in science, and really combine it with what he had figured out over his career as a primary care doctor, working with genetics and really looking at how you can understand someone on a deeper level and really get to the underlying factors underneath someone's biochemistry at the genetic level. So things just kind of went from there, and I started working with clients and really found a passion in genetics and understanding the body in that way. And I'm kind of the classic example of I had to fix myself before I could fix other people, and then was just sort of in the right place at the right time and got given the key.
I love it. Yeah. Now, what are some of the biohacks that you have done? So my listeners have heard about biohacking before. So what are some things that you have done and had success with, or you enjoy doing?
Yeah, I really love using light as a biohack. I think that one of the big things that we're overall as a society missing and kind of getting wrong is our light exposure habits. We're constantly inside. We're not getting sunlight. We're exposing ourselves to all kinds of irregular frequencies of light that we wouldn't have been exposed to, say 200 years ago before we invented the light bulb. Once you see the advent of the light bulb at the beginning of the 20th century, things start to shift in terms of certain disease patterns and things like that. And our body is pretty exquisitely tuned to respond to sunlight. I mean, you think about the way that all organisms on Earth evolved over millennia. We were doing it in this very specific environment with a very stable, specific set of light frequencies. And when you shift that, it seems to really alter some function. And so one of the things that I've really enjoyed doing is learning how to integrate natural sunlight back into my life. And I mean, it sounds really simple. And it's, you could argue that it's not even really a biohack, but it's so profound in the way that it can change things that I now consider sunlight and electromagnetism to be kind of at the forefront of what's the first thing you can do on a daily basis to improve your health and improve your body's function.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Do you do any, besides sunlight, do you do any like infrared or anything along those lines?
I have an infrared light on me right now.
I love it.
Yeah. I do an infrared sauna most mornings when I wake up and meditate for 15, 20 minutes, get relaxed and bathe in the infrared sauna.
See, I know we connect. That's what I do every morning too.
Nice.
And then I have a light that I do some extra lightweight light. I'm still trying to figure out how I can get the red light, because I have light therapy. I have a little thing that has red light therapy and infrared in it. So it gives me all like 4 different wavelengths, but I'm like, I should put it in the sauna, double it up. But then I'm like, but it'll overheat in the sauna. So I'm like, I got to figure something out. I'll figure out a way to keep that thing cool so I can actually extend it even more.
Mm-hmm. I've been experimenting with when I'm on a computer for a while or I'm doing a call like this, trying to get some extra red light in the frequency to maybe offset a little bit of the blue light coming from the screen.
Yeah, no, totally. No, and light is definitely a biohack. I mean, it's as you said, the lighting of what we use in today's world definitely throws her off, even on our skin. I mean, I was talking to a patient yesterday about she's getting into protecting with light and blue light. And I was like, great. So he's like, I'm going to get blackout curtains. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm sorry, not blackout curtains. She was going to get an eye mask. And I was like, well, that's good, but your skin sees too. She's like, what do you mean? I'm like, they have light receptors. So the light that you have coming in is still going to be picked up unless you're totally covered. And they're like, oh man. I'm like, just go get the covers, block it all out. You'll be fine. You'll be able to get deeper sleep. But then I'm like, I can go further, and I'm like, I don't want to confuse them. So I left it at that. But yeah, now nutrigenomics. A lot of probably my listeners don't know what that is. Can you just kind of explain a little bit about what that is and all the fun stuff about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So nutrigenomics is the study of how nutrition, herbs, supplements, anything that you put in your body changes your genetic expression. And when I say genetic expression, what I mean is, when I was in high school, I was taught the central dogma of biology, probably most people were, where your genes code for proteins, which code for traits. So at the genetic level, you have the specific pattern of these nucleotides that we kind of abbreviated letters like A, T, C, or G. And the specific pattern of those is going to code for this specific protein that will create, say, your eyes being blue or my eyes being brown. And that's kind of it. And then, about 20, 30 years ago, we really started to, unlock this other layer called epigenetics that can allow those proteins to change and at the genetic level cause a little bit different expression. And it's a dynamic system. It responds to the environment. When you put a specific food in your body, it's information, right? Like, it's not just nutrients that you break down and use. It's actually information about the environment that you live in. And so nutrigenomics is really looking at how your body incorporates this information and changes in a way to adapt on a day-to-day basis. And it's really exciting because we can leverage all of these changes that we want to see. And, for example, saturated fat, there's a lot of kind of back and forth now between the keto world and the vegan world. And just, people have a lot of different opinions on saturated fat. And for some people, it really does seem to increase cardiac risk or increase inflammation. And then some people, seem to be okay, seem to have more flexibility with it. And when you look at genetics, you can start to understand why some people might have a nutrigenomic response to saturated fat in one way, and some people might in a different way. And when you look at how those genes get turned on or off, you can actually look at these little markers that get attached to the genes called methylation or acetylation marks, and kind of understand, are these genes turning on or are they turning off? And when you know what they do, say, this gene, we know it's pro-inflammatory. It's going to cause more inflammation in the body. Well, when you look at it in scientific studies and see, well, there's more of these marks that are actually causing this gene to express more, say, when this population eats more saturated fat, you can get a pretty good understanding that, well, that's probably why it's causing problems. But then you can also look at this other population with different genetic variants that might cause them to respond differently and say, maybe not have that inflammatory promoting response. So nutrigenomics on a general level is looking at how food or supplements or the environment impacts genetic expression. But then when you personalize it, you can use people's individual genetic code to predict their personal responses. And that's where I think it gets really fun and exciting.
That sounds pretty cool. I mean, so is it like, for example, I had a test done back in 2012. They checked my genetics to see based on my genes, what is my body more prone to wanting based on carbs, protein, fats, and then also exercise regimen. What would my body desire? Which was kind of interesting because it was the diet was off from what I normally eat, but the exercise was dead on. Like, I'm a high intensity workout guy. 3 days a week is all I need. I take one day hard, I go off for a day, go back, go off, go back on, and I'll have everything what I want it to be. Mm-hmm. But what I found interesting was, though, from a genetic perspective, fats for me, just fats in general across the board, my body overabsorbs them or doesn't utilize them properly enough. Mm-hmm. So in order let's say saturated fats, I would have to take supplements like L-carnitine or carnosine to help utilize and break down those fats to be utilized better instead of sticking around and causing havoc on my heart, on my health. And it kind of made some sense because my grandfather had 5 heart attacks in his life and 2 open heart surgeries. And he didn't really eat that unhealthy. He lived he lived an Italian lifestyle. There's pasta, but again, normal Italians don't eat a lot of pasta. They have like a handful of it. It's not like major big bowls of it. So his diet was pretty good, but he had, there was a lot of fat intake in his diet and like his breakfast and things like that. That brought some curiosity to it. And it was kind of interesting to see. Does that kind of relate to nutrigenomics?
Yeah, absolutely. And to give you a distinction too, there's something called nutrigenetics, and there's also something called nutrigenomics. And it's a subtle difference, but it's kind of important where nutrigenetics is going to look more at understanding. Say you might have a higher nutritional requirement because of genes, or you don't metabolize saturated fat as well, so you just don't eat as much saturated fat. And then nutrigenomics is actually shifting the genetic expression so that you can metabolize that saturated fat better.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's like one is kind of making up for a gap, and the other one is really shifting the function so that that gap doesn't exist anymore. And it's kind of, you can use both in complementary ways.
I love it. How does, some of this stuff with utilizing this, how does that affect with mind body type stuff? I mean, obviously it's going to affect health in certain ways, but what's the effects? What's the benefits of utilizing this? I know it gets a lot of, there's a lot to go into this, but what's some of the effects that people can have from utilizing this type of principles?
Yeah, I think, when we're talking about mental and emotional health, so much of it is just the ability to be present, right? And be mindful and have the mental space and the capacity to really do the work, or, sit with a difficult emotion, or think about something really all the way through. And I think that a lot of what people experience right now, that kind of manifests as, difficult emotional stuff and mental illness, that type of thing, is partially related to just not having the metabolic capacity to power your brain in a way that allows you to really sit with that stuff. And so getting the proper nutrition, and really understanding where you might need more support is really going to lead to having a more fully functioning brain, which when you look at how you're showing up in life, I think that I don't like isolating it solely to just the biochemistry of what's going on, but that biochemistry really impacts the mental functioning and the ability to really explore things and be curious and show up in the way that you want to.
I like that. And I know that mental illness is one of the growing, it's actually the fastest growing disease in the world right now as we speak. How does shifting, knowing the nutrigenomics and nutrigenetics, how can that play a big role in things with someone's health, especially with changing with oils they use or fats they consume and things along that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the link between inflammation and depression has been pretty well shown. And, it's a bit of a chicken or egg type of thing. But just in the same way, you can, if you're depressed, you can intervene in a number of ways, right? You can do nutritional therapy. You can take a pharmaceutical if that's your thing. You can do various types of talk therapy. And they all show some effectiveness. But if you're getting the baseline things right with your diet, and you understand really, maybe there's something in a choline gene, right? That you have much higher nutritional requirements. I just did a read with someone where that was the case, where it looked like they really needed to supplement choline, which is found in eggs and liver, and I'm going to be really curious to follow that person and see how they respond to that on a mental health level. And I think that there's so many factors working against us from a societal standpoint right now, that there's not a lot of positive models for healthy emotional living in mainstream society. So, you got that going against you. And really look, I mean, there's some really interesting factors on the biochemical side of things, things that have to do with methylation and specific nutrient deficiencies that are really tied into mental health. And I've seen some pretty dramatic results with my clients when they just get the right things in there. People that have been on pharmaceuticals for 20 years, and then they finally figure out, well, okay, I've actually had a methylation deficiency, and they start taking some SAMe, and I've seen people, safely get off of their pharmaceutical medications because they're actually now supplying their brain. And this is a pathway that really heavily influences neurotransmitter production, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen those people really start to thrive after years of not getting the result they need, because the way that, mainstream psychiatry works doesn't take into account these underlying factors. And I think the nutrigenetics, nutrigenomics really gives people a deeper look under the hood, so to speak, like that.
I love it. With your work, do you do anything with the microbiome, the basic probiotics, and just the microbiome in general, and how it plays a role with gene expression and things like that?
Yeah. For certain people, the gut is going to be a major key and a major player. And, for certain people too, it's interesting. There's one set of genes I look at, that are actually related to B12 metabolism. And they're called FUT2 genes. And what they do is they actually code for the markers on cells that indicate what your blood type is to the rest of your immune cells. And there's a certain group of people, it's maybe about 15 to 20% of the population, that doesn't produce these markers on the lining of their intestines. And it radically changes gut microbiome population, because there's certain types of species of bacteria that actually feed off of those markers. They're food for the gut microbiome. So in those people, they tend to have higher levels of B12, but they tend to be deficient in bifidobacteria. And so with those, and then because they're deficient in bifidobacteria, sometimes they're deficient in lysine or carnitine as well, because those bifido will produce those. So, even though I'm looking at the human genome, there's still occasionally some things I can tell that are going to be impacted from that in the gut microbiome, just because of the way that the body's set up, that's going to influence those populations.
Very cool stuff. Now, I know we were talking, some types of diseases came up, and sometimes people think, the old doctrine from the medical world has always says that, genes play a huge role on our health. And if your mother had cancer, good chance you're going to have cancer because it's all in the genes, and this is just what genetically you are. How true is that? And how true is that, number one? And number two, is there something else that kind of has disproven that in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I love how you're thinking about that. And leading to this answer. Yeah, I think there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more ability to shift the body than we previously thought, and change disease risks from a hereditary standpoint. Because if you understand that, say your mom and her mom had a certain type of cancer, well, what that means is that there's some pathway in the body that is causing that to happen. And if you can kind of understand these factors, you can do things that shift that risk, right? There's a set of genes I look at that are liver detox genes that have to do with breaking down estrogen, for example. And people that have breast cancer tend to have altered estrogen detoxification, where they don't break it down to the fully inactive form. And, if you're someone that has that in your family, you understand, I have this pathway that's genetically influenced. But there's ways to alter this pathway. There's ways to epigenetically, nutrigenomically change that function. And by the way, it's the best way to do that science has found is with brassica vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, and there's some extracts from that are useful for shifting that function genetically as well. So, like, for example, if you know that that's something in your family, but then you can actually understand, well, like, why has that been happening? Well, it gives you the the information and the ability to potentially change that. And looking at how dynamic and flexible the human body is, you really want to look at all those things as, evolutionary adaptations that might just be in the wrong environment right now. Like a lot of people have the mentality that there's bad genes, there's bad mutations. And for the most part, I think that, the human body has evolved in a way that's intelligent and smart, and it's all just about matching yourself up with the right environment. So, something that, was a survival advantage, 500-600 years ago, because we're living in a different environment now. Well, that just might not be an advantage anymore. And it's about sort of retuning what you're putting in your body, how you're living, that actually allows you to kind of take advantage of those things again, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, it totally does. And for the listeners out there, epigenetics is a term that means epi means above, and genetics is obviously the genes. So it's what is a major factor that controls the genes or plays a role on the genes itself. And so, Dave, like you were saying, it's the environment in a sense, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And to give you an example, I touched on this before, but some of your listeners might have heard of like the MTHFR gene variant, the methylation pathway. Well, there's certain gene variants that are associated with lower methylation. And, there's a whole litany of different disease states associated with that. But what people don't often realize is that the population background demographically, where people come from in the world, where that have those variations at a higher rate, are places where there's lots of folate, places where there's lots of green leafy vegetables. And what they've shown is that when people have the lower functioning MTHFR variants, but they're getting a lot of folate, it's actually cancer protective. They actually have a lower risk. And so that's actually an evolutionary adaptation if you're just in the right environment and have access to the right food.
I love it. Yeah, like even with MTHFR, I know we see that sometimes with kids who have autism, and they can't process things properly through the methylation processes because of that. Anything that because I see a lot of kids in my office, in my chiropractic office, is there anything that they can, things they can do besides dark leafy green vegetables, or is it with folate and stuff like that? Or is there other things that can help in that process?
Yeah, well, you want to look at the whole pathway, which is going to include a lot of B vitamins, B6 and B12. There's some tests that might be worth running, looking at like homocysteine, potentially, direct methylation tests. And SAMe is also a great supplement for that in terms of it's kind of the end product of that pathway. Mm-hmm. So you end up kind of bypassing the whole thing and just providing the raw methyl groups. I haven't done personally a lot of work with autistic children, but my understanding is that there's some pretty good results in coming from that as well, and looking at those pathways and how they impact that.
Awesome. Now, going back to epigenetics, because epigenetics, I know food plays a role, but I think that's only really like maybe sometimes part of the equation. I know with epigenetics, like you ever, I'm assuming you have, but just taking Bruce Lipton's work when he talks about all this, right? So how does like a belief system, thoughts, stress, those types of things really play a role on epigenetics and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question too. The immune system is wired to respond to stress regardless of whether it comes from internal source or external source, right? So there's kind of, we think about worry, mental stress, existential dread, that's going to be a big impact of what your belief system is like. Like, what's your worldview? How do you understand yourself in relationship to the universe and your consciousness and what else is out there? That is going to potentially create stress with how you handle situations and people, versus, just being under stress from, not getting the right nutrition. They kind of have a common end pathway in the immune system. And I love the field of psychoneuroimmunology, which really looks at that. Like, what's the interface between how your immune system functions and what you think? What does your psychology do? And there's it's just incredible the flexibility of our bodies to respond. And I mean, it's totally profound. And it, the cultural beliefs that people hold, have a big impact on this. Like one of my favorite little kind of anecdotes is that apparently in Japan, menopause is seen as the sort of like blossoming or flowering into like older womanhood, into like, sort of becoming like the mentor role, rather than in, America, it's kind of seen as this like the thing to dread. And, you're becoming this haggard old woman or what, and apparently in Japan, women going into menopause do not experience hot flashes or the same types of symptoms here. That it just is not something that is part of the culture. And so here, the way that we perceive it seems to actually influence the symptoms. And when you look at, so many different, quote unquote disease states, I think there's a pretty strong psychological origin point. And, I don't want to be isolationist with that either. I think there's always an interaction between, how your body's wired, what your genetics are sort of like propelling you towards, what the environment is doing to influence that, and then the way you think about it. And if you're, putting yourself in a position where you're worrying about something, or you are expecting something to happen, confirmation bias is huge. You're going to get a result. And I think you can leverage that too, in a lot of the work that I see on your site and learning how to manifest what you really want in reality. It's about focusing your attention and your energy in a certain place. And I think the same holds true for your health and your body.
Yeah, no, massively. I mean, it's a game changer. And I know like Dr. Bruce Lipton, he talks a lot about too, how perception and how the body perceives things massively plays a role in genetic expression.
Absolutely.
And so it's just powerful stuff here when we get into that. And we talked about light before, and I was going to tie it in earlier, and now we're in epigenetics. Might as well keep on going with this. How does and maybe this has already been answered, but how does the overload of like lighting, of all the artificial stuff that we're dealing with, how does that really affect our epigenetic standpoint? And you might have answered this already, but I want to just make sure I asked it again.
Yeah, totally. And I will say that my real deep scientific understanding of it really only scratches the surface, but I'll do my best to answer that question. I think one of the big things that it impacts is circadian genes and the way that our circadian genes control all these other functions in the body. So, at the beginning of every cell in our body, we have these circadian genes that control what's going on in that cell on a hourly, daily basis. For example, you want melatonin secretion to be high at night, and there's all of these genes that that act as conductors kind of in your body and synchronize everything ideally. And those genes are really tied in to what you're referring to, those photoreceptors in the skin and the eyes, the opsins, the melanopsins. And they're sensitive not just to visible light, but they're sensitive to UV, they're sensitive to infrared, and they're designed to really feed these signals of like, hey, what time of day is it? What should we be awake or should we be asleep? And so what these artificial lights are doing is really confusing the body in certain ways, sending the wrong circadian signals. And you can imagine like, if you're conducting a symphony, you need everyone to be playing together in order for it to really sound good and play how it's supposed to play. And if there's like a clarinet playing out of time or playing out of key, you're going to notice it. And you can kind of liken that to poor health, disease states, energy fatigue, energy issues. Something's out of balance, because not just, health is rhythmic. Like everything in our body has a rhythm to it. Yeah. From whether that's something that's going to happen every day, or when you look at something like a methylation reaction happening millions of times a second. So these rhythms are designed to, ideally be consistent and controlled by this set of circadian genes that is controlled by light. And so when you get the wrong frequencies of light, you mess up the rhythm. And, and going back to melatonin, that's one of the easier things to understand is that, melatonin secretion happens in the presence of darkness, and blue light is the signal to stop producing melatonin because it's daylight. It's time to get up. So if you're exposed to too much blue light, your body, through these circadian genes, suppresses melatonin production. And that, is just kind of the first layer to it. But if you can imagine how almost all the biochemical processes in our body have a rhythm to it and have an element of circadian control, light's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, they say once, I forgot what the research is on this right off the top of my head, but I know like just a little bit of being the time on your phone for like, I think it's 10 minutes, 5 minutes. It's not a lot. Can throw off your whole entire throw off a lot of your melatonin production in the evening, at night, and then also, and obviously you're looking at your phone at night, and then also will disrupt your deep sleep or restorative part of your sleep because of that too. Mm-hmm. Massive stuff here. Now, how can someone leverage sleep? I mean, it sounds like obviously blocking out the light is one thing. Is there anything else that they can do to leverage sleep?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things people can do is develop a sleep ritual, and really have a consistent way that they sleep. Really doing something that psychologically puts them in a state where they're ready to rest, whether that's deep breathing or meditation. There's also some good herbs and supplements like lavender or passion flower, things like that kind of promote the GABA system, which is going to be the really relaxing neurotransmitter that helps people fall asleep. It kind of depends on the person, and that's some of the genetic things that I see sometimes are people will actually have altered melatonin synthesis pathways, and so looking at the genes, you can kind of get a feel like is 5-HTP, which is one of the precursors, the building blocks of melatonin. Is that going to be effective or not for this person based on sort of, is this gene in that synthesis pathway? Is that more or less functional? So you can get pretty targeted with that kind of thing. Doing your temperature of your room also seems to impact it. Like having a little bit of a cooler room helps. And what you mentioned before in terms of having a completely darked out room, I think that's one of the biggest things, is just absolutely no light exposure at night while you're sleeping is huge.
What about EMFs? Like some people sleep with their phone or they have their alarm clock in the room. How does that play a role?
Yeah, I'd say the less EMFs, the better. I certainly haven't seen any studies that show that there's a benefit to having more EMFs around. And my personal preference is on the side of caution and on the side of you were basically in a worldwide experiment with no control group right now. So I'd say that I personally find that I sleep better when I turn off my Wi-Fi, no cell phone in the bedroom. And my personal habit now is like just airplane mode all the time, unless I need to use my phone. It's an airplane mode.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, EMF it's just, and it's getting worse. I mean, what they're doing now, 5G towers here in the US and stuff, and there's just no testing on it. And it's like, this isn't going to be good. Birds are being disrupted by how they fly because of them, and a lot of other things. So it's worldwide. It's definitely an experiment with no control group. Like how you said that. What about meal timing? How does that play a role with circadian type of rhythms and stuff like that? Because I've read some people and heard some other individuals talk about different times to eat, meal timing for this and that, how that plays a role with certain stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is meal timing during the day. So the research is real clear that your circadian clock has multiple inputs. So we talked about light. Exercise is one. So if you're up and running around right before you go to sleep, it's going to be harder to fall asleep. You need a little bit of space to where you're actually resting and not like doing a workout right before you try to go to bed. That's just a signal to your circadian genes that it's time to be awake. And Same thing there in terms of, excuse me, in terms of meal timing. If you eat too close to bed, it actually suppresses melatonin as well. So you want to try overall to finish your last meal, ideally before sunset, kind of maybe a little bit earlier in the summer. And there's a couple really good studies that show meal timing at night influences insulin, influences glucose sensitivity in a negative way. And so trying to shorten your meal timing window, some of your listeners might be familiar with the concept of intermittent fasting.
Yep.
I think that even if you're not doing the full on intermittent fasting and shortening it to 8 hours, the shorter you can get it, the better. Especially just trying to restrict eating during dark. I also am a proponent here of kind of following your body too on meal timing. I think there's value for some people in skipping breakfast if that's natural. But I think for a lot of people, actually getting a good meal first thing in the day will help in various ways with leptin sensitivity and really sort of priming the body to have good glucose control over the day. But some people seem to do better also with skipping breakfast. So I think it's kind of dependent there on the person.
I've heard from, you ever follow Dr. Jack Kruse at all?
Yes, I do.
So he made a statement that was kind of interesting. I haven't found a lot of research on it yet. It's been a while. I heard it, I think it was over a year ago, almost 2 years ago, where he would say that people who skip breakfast are, what do you call it, blue light toxic or blue light toxicity. I forgot the term. I can't remember the third word he used, but it would just mean that they're too much around blue light, and that's why they're skipping out on meals in the morning instead of the evening. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but I found that to be interesting because I am one that was like, it's easy because I practice intermittent fasting, and it's one of the things where I'm like, I can skip a breakfast, no problem, and I'll eat more in the nighttime. And then when I heard that, I was like, let me try to flip this, and I was like, interesting. This is not as my body's not as it adapted now to it, but before I was like, it was having some struggles with that, and I was like, maybe there is some truth to this.
Yeah. He's definitely an interesting character when it comes to the blue light piece. And I also don't know necessarily always what to make of statements like that, but I also have to give him a lot of credit because he's been right about a lot of things.
He has.
And definitely informed a lot of my awareness and opinion about light and EMF. And I'd be curious if there's any actual research on that. But at the same time, I find that at least for me, I function way better when I eat breakfast.
Me too. Now I do. Like before I didn't, but now it's like I wake up and my body's like, let's eat. Let's get something in the system ASAP. And I'm always like, it's not that I'm hungry. It's more of like a nutrition thing. Like my body's just like, hey, let's get nutrients in me. We got things to do. And I'm like, all right, let's do this.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of if you can do it, restricting, finishing your meals earlier in the day, finishing in mid-afternoon versus the morning thing. I think there's more value to that as well.
What if you get up really early in the morning and it's dark out? Do you wait till the sun comes up? Or because I'm an early bird who gets up way before the sun's up. Is it something that we recommend eating when the sun eventually does come up, or what's your with your work and everything? What do you say to that?
That's a good question, and I'm equally as curious about the answer to that as you are. My guess would be to eat when you get up, but at the same time, I don't think I'm informed enough to really give you a full answer on that. Cool. If you find anything out, let me know.
I will. I'm assuming, and I think it's different for everybody, but like if you're getting up, like for me, first thing I do when I get up in the morning is I go ahead and I get my sun up and running so that I get some infrared going because it's dark, but I want to get the infrared hitting me so that I can at least get some of that good rays in me. And then of course when the sun comes up, but I'll still eat depending on how I feel. I go based on how I feel though, but there are times I'll wake up and I'm like, okay, let's hurry up and let's do my meditation. Let's get into my peace zone and then let's eat afterwards because I need to get food in me. But it's variant. And again, like I said, I haven't, definitely some research to do. That's what I said. There's always something new and interesting to learn from. So,
Absolutely. I actually love to like kind of expand that point a little bit too, is just paying attention to your body and really feeling into what's right for you in the day. And I think that that's a skill that can be honed. And the more you kind of go down this path of biohacking or self-improvement with health or anything that, and combining the mindfulness aspect into it, the more you're able to make these decisions that are actually in tune with what your body wants. It's like looking at genetic information is one way to do that, and listening to your body's own intuition is another. And it's really fascinating to me a lot of the time, like how, like you mentioned, the genetic test you did, your workout routine was like you were already doing it, and so it's like it's really interesting to find those parallels and correlations that sometimes objective data will reinforce. But I think that one of the best skills you can learn, like across the board, for anything is a self-awareness piece, but especially as you're trying to improve your health or improve your lifestyle, it's like really learning how to develop that sense of interoception of body awareness is super huge. So I like that you mentioned.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's something I teach a lot on, is just how to tap into those feelings and listen to that inner voice, the intuition that is wiser than all things. It doesn't need logic to explain itself. It just knows. But I think that's a great piece that I think more people, and I think for the listeners out there, you guys can definitely learn this. It's like building a muscle. It's like learning an instrument. It just takes time and a lot of trust in yourself, which I know from my journey, I used to self-doubt myself like crazy, and like anyone else. And now I don't at all. And I trust this process, and it's amazing how it's usually dead on. And the only times I'm wrong is because I let my head get in the way, which I always find that to be interesting. But listening to your body is really important. I mean, there's times where I know I look at my wife and I'm like, we're having steak tonight. I need some red meat. And she's just like, what's going on? I'm like, I don't know. I need red meat. I need to eat. And I'll polish off a nice steak, and I'm like, all right, I'm good. I'm good. Or sometimes I need to eat. I need to binge on some red meat for a little bit, which is weird. I don't eat a lot of red meat. I eat maybe once a week, if that, sometimes every other week. But there are times where body's like just craving. And it's like, all right, I don't know what's going on, but I don't need to figure this out. Let's just give it what it needs. And then I feel absolutely amazing and like energized, which is always a cool, but also a weird thing.
Yeah, I talked to a client earlier today. I was doing a genetic read for her, and one of the biggest areas that it seemed like her body was really, really needed support in was selenium. And she was telling me how she craved turkey, and she didn't like fish, so she wasn't going to crave that. But turkey's got a pretty high amount of selenium, and I was like, yeah, it kind of makes sense.
That's awesome. Well, brother, we're winding up to the end here. And as always before, I always want to give an opportunity for you to share with the listeners, as I'll put this in the show notes though, but how can people, get a hold of you and connect with you and so forth?
Yeah, so people can go to my website, David-Krantz, KRANTZ.com. And people can read some of my articles. I've got a couple free informational webinars on there. And if you're interested in learning more, having a conversation, send me a message to the contact form there. I generally offer free 20, 30-minute consultations just to, feel out whether we'd be a good fit to work together, give you some more information about whether epigenetic coaching is right for you, and have a conversation and see where it goes. So anyone that's interested can go to david-krantz.com and send me an email.
And guys, check out his, I know CBD and endocrine system and all that stuff's been huge. I know you have a free webinar on that. Mm-hmm. So definitely check that stuff out and so much more. David, loved having you on. I definitely have you back on again. There is so much we can dive into that we didn't get a chance to get into, and that's definitely for another time. But I appreciate your time. Had a lot of fun.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on. I had a lot of fun too. Great conversation, and would totally love to do it again.
And so you got homework now. We got to figure out, eating before night, when you wake up, if we can figure this out.
Yeah. I'll see if I can unearth anything.
I'll keep you tuned too also, brother. Well, appreciate it. And thanks again. Until next time.
All right. Great talking to you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. For past shows, please visit www.empoweryourreality.com. I hope this show inspired you and added to your life to help you on the journey to rediscover who you really are.
To connect with us on Facebook, please visit www.facebook.com/Dr. Vic Manzo. Check us out on Twitter. The handle is Dr. Vic21. Follow us on Instagram, www.instagram.com/Dr. Vic Manzo. If you were inspired by the podcast, pay it forward by sharing it with someone who you know can benefit from it. Thank you again for listening to the Mindful Experiment podcast, sharing paths to help you rediscover your infinite potential.